The Smith family, a proud black household, moved into the picturesque suburban neighborhood of Cedarville, eager to embrace their fresh start. Little did they know, their arrival would spark unexpected tensions with a longtime resident, Mrs. Carter. What began as a simple neighborhood barbecue to foster connections would soon escalate into a dramatic moment that left everyone stunned. What happened at the Smiths' gathering, and how did it become a turning point for the entire community? Stay tuned to find out. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage and community. The sun bathed Cedarville in a warm glow, illuminating its tree-lined streets and pristine lawns. This suburban paradise was everything one could dream of. Children riding bikes, neighbors chatting over picket fences, and weekend block parties that brought everyone together. The homes, mostly two-story with brick exteriors and wraparound porches, embodied the charm and stability Cedarville was known for. The residents were a mix of families who had lived there for decades and newcomers drawn by the area's excellent schools, safe streets, and strong sense of community. To an outsider, Cedarville seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Yet beneath the surface, not all was as idyllic as it appeared. Among the neighborhood's oldest residents, there lingered an unspoken resistance to change. For those who had seen Cedarville evolve over the years, new families, especially those who didn't match their traditional image of what a Cedarville resident should look like, often sparked unease. This undercurrent of tension was something the Smith family, thrilled about their new home on Willowbrook Drive, was blissfully unaware of. The Smiths were a remarkable family. Jacob Smith, the father, was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose calm and composed demeanor reflected his inner strength. His deep brown skin and neatly trimmed beard exuded quiet confidence. Jacob had recently been appointed as Cedarville's new police chief, a role he'd earned through years of unwavering dedication and leadership. His wife, Camille, was the heart of the family, a warm and gracious schoolteacher adored by her students for her patience and infectious kindness. Together, they had two bright children, 13-year-old Olivia, who was blossoming into a poised and confident young woman, and 8-year-old Ethan, whose endless curiosity and energy kept the family on their toes. After months of searching, the Smiths had finally found their dream home, a charming two-story house with a spacious backyard and a welcoming front porch, perfect for evenings spent watching the neighborhood go by. As their car rolled into the driveway, the excitement in the air was palpable. "This is it," Camille said, her voice filled with awe as she took in the sight of their new home. "Our new beginning." Jacob smiled and wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "It's perfect," he said. "I can already picture us making so many memories here." Olivia and Ethan didn't wait for an invitation. They bolted toward the front door, eager to explore every nook and cranny. Camille laughed, shaking her head. "They're going to love it here," she said. Inside, the house was everything they'd dreamed of. As they began unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, Jacob and Camille couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. They had worked tirelessly to reach this point, and now they were ready to embrace their new life in Cedarville. Unbeknownst to the Smith family, not everyone in their new neighborhood of Cedarville was as warm and welcoming as they had hoped. Across the street, in a house as pristine and orderly as the others, an older woman stood at her window, observing the new arrivals with a critical eye. Mrs. Eleanor Carter was a staple of Cedarville. At 72, she had lived on Willowbrook Drive for over 4 decades and saw herself as the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's traditions. Sharp and composed, with neatly styled silver hair and a penchant for immaculately pressed blouses and tailored slacks, Mrs. Carter appeared every bit the picture of a dignified, proper lady. She was polite, well-mannered, and quick to offer a pleasant smile to her neighbors. But behind that mask of civility, Mrs. Carter harbored deep-seated prejudices. To her, Cedarville wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a bastion of traditional values, where everyone knew their place and where changes were viewed with suspicion. Over the years, as the community evolved and more diverse families moved in, Mrs. Carter had watched with growing dismay. She resented what she saw as a disruption to the neighborhood's long-standing order. Now, As she stood at her window, watching the Smith family unload boxes from their moving truck, that familiar knot of resentment tightened in her chest. "More of them," she muttered under her breath, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "Just what this neighborhood needs." Mrs. Carter's eyes lingered on Jacob, the father, whose commanding presence was unmistakable even in casual clothes. She had heard the buzz around the neighborhood about Cedarville's new police chief, but his impressive title did little to soften her feelings. To her, the Smiths were outsiders, interlopers who didn't belong. The first encounter between Mrs. Carter and the Smiths happened a few days after they moved in. As usual, Mrs. Carter was out walking her small, yappy terrier Pippin, who barked furiously at anything that moved. As she passed by the Smiths' house, she noticed Camille in the front yard, planting flowers in a small bed near the porch. Mrs. Carter hesitated, debating whether to approach. Finally, deciding it was her duty to welcome the new family, she crossed the street and walked up the driveway, her smile tight and her tone clipped. "Good morning," she called out, her voice formal and just loud enough to carry over Pippin's barking. Camille looked up, brushing dirt off her gardening gloves. "Good morning," she replied brightly, her smile genuine. "You must be one of our new neighbors. I'm Camille Smith." Mrs. Carter nodded curtly. "Eleanor Carter," she said by way of introduction. "I've lived here for many years." "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Carter," Camille said warmly despite the cool reception. "We're so excited to be here. Everyone seems so friendly." Mrs. Carter's lips twitched into a non-committal smile, her sharp eyes scanning Camille from head to toe. "It's different now," she murmured, her tone making it clear she didn't think that was a good thing. Camille's smile faltered slightly, but she kept her tone polite. "Change can be good, don't you think?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Carter replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Her gaze shifted to the flowers Camille was planting. "Those are lovely. I hope they'll do well in this soil." "Thank you, I hope so too," Camille said, still cheerful, though there was now a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "I'm still getting the hang of the garden. Do you have any tips?" Mrs. Carter shrugged, already losing interest. "Just water them properly," she said vaguely before tugging Pippin's leash. "Well, I must be going. Good day, Mrs. Smith." "Good day, Mrs. Carter," Camille replied, watching as the older woman turned and walked away, her back stiff with disapproval. As Mrs. Carter continued her walk, she felt a small sense of satisfaction. She had done her duty as a neighbor, but more importantly, she had made it clear that she wasn't about to roll out the welcome mat for the Smiths. In her mind, they would have to prove themselves, though if she were honest, she didn't believe they ever could. In the days that followed, Jacob and Camille made an effort to get to know their neighbors. They greeted passers-by, introduced themselves to those nearby, and even extended invitations for coffee and conversation. While some responded warmly, others were more distant, offering polite nods or brief exchanges before hurrying on their way. The Smiths couldn't quite put their finger on it, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of tension. It wasn't overt hostility, but rather a subtle resistance that lingered in the air, making it clear they were not yet fully embraced. One afternoon, as Jacob watched from the porch while Ethan played in the yard, he noticed Mrs. Carter walking past their house again, her sharp eyes briefly meeting his before she looked away. He sighed, sensing that winning over this particular neighbor would be more of a challenge than they'd anticipated. "We'll just have to show her who we really are," Jacob murmured to himself. And so the Smiths resolved to continue their efforts, hoping that time and kindness would bridge the gap that prejudice had created. Jacob Smith decided it was time to formally introduce himself to Mrs. Eleanor Carter. He had seen her often, either walking her yappy terrier, Pippin, or tending to her meticulously maintained rose bushes. Believing a friendly gesture could bridge the gap, he walked across the street, climbed the steps to her pristine porch, and knocked on her door. When Mrs. Carter opened the door, her expression was unreadable. Jacob offered his warmest smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. I'm Jacob Smith, your new neighbor." Mrs. Carter eyed him carefully before replying in a flat tone, "Yes, I've seen you around." She paused before adding, "I suppose you're settling in." "We are, thank you," Jacob said, his smile unwavering despite her lukewarm response. "It's a lovely neighborhood. We're excited to be part of the community. Mrs. Carter gave a slow nod. I hope you find it to your liking, she said, her tone carrying little warmth or enthusiasm. Jacob chuckled lightly, trying to ease the tension. I'm sure we will. It's a big change for us, but we're looking forward to getting to know everyone. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Mrs. Carter nodded again, her tone dismissive. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Sensing the conversation had run its course, Jacob maintained his politeness. Well, it was nice to meet you, Mrs. Carter. I'll let you get back to your day. Good day, Mr. Smith, she replied, her voice as cold as ever, before closing the door. As Jacob walked back to his house, a nagging sense of unease crept over him. Mrs. Carter had been civil, but there was an undeniable edge to her demeanor, as if she were tolerating his presence rather than welcoming it. Later that evening, Jacob shared the interaction with his wife Camille as they tidied up after dinner. She wasn't very friendly, was she? Camille remarked, her brow furrowing. No, not really, Jacob admitted, shrugging. But maybe she's just set in her ways. I'm sure she'll warm up eventually. Camille nodded, though doubt lingered in her expression. There was something about Mrs. Carter, her frosty demeanor, the way she looked at them as though they didn't belong, that left Camille feeling unsettled. As the days turned into weeks, the Smiths continued to settle into their home, making small improvements and getting familiar with the area. The children adjusted to their new schools, where Olivia quickly made friends with her bubbly charm, while Ethan explored the playground with his trademark curiosity. Jacob threw himself into his responsibilities as Cedarville's new police chief, navigating the demands of his role with characteristic poise. Despite their efforts to immerse themselves in the community, the undercurrent of tension remained. While some neighbors were friendly, others offered polite but distant nods, or exchanged only the bare minimum of pleasantries. Even Mrs. Carter's aloofness persisted. Though her behavior was never outright rude, it was subtly dismissive. When the Smiths passed her on the street, she barely acknowledged them. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings seemed to conveniently skip their mailbox. And when she did interact with them, her remarks carried a thinly veiled undercurrent of judgment. One particular interaction stuck with Camille. Mrs. Carter had stopped by the front yard while Camille was pruning her flower beds. Your children are so well behaved, Mrs. Carter commented, her tone dripping with surprise. You must be very strict with them. Camille smiled tightly, understanding the implication behind the words. We believe in raising them with respect and love, she replied evenly, refusing to be rattled. Just like any other parent. Mrs. Carter nodded slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing. Of course, she said, before quickly changing the subject and continuing her walk. It was clear to Camille that Mrs. Carter didn't consider them like any other parent. Other neighbors, while not as openly frosty as Mrs. Carter, shared her unease in quieter ways. When the Smiths extended invitations to coffee or casual conversations, the responses were polite but distant. They were included in neighborhood activities just enough to avoid accusations of exclusion, but never in a way that felt truly welcoming. Jacob and Camille did their best to remain optimistic. They attended community events, visited local parks, and even hosted a small housewarming gathering for a few neighbors. But the subtle exclusion and passive-aggressive remarks were impossible to ignore. One evening, as Jacob and Camille sat on their porch, watching the sunset, she voiced what they had both been feeling. Do you think they'll ever see us as part of this community? Camille asked softly, her eyes on the horizon. Jacob took a deep breath before replying, I don't know, but we can't let it stop us. This is our home now, and we'll show them we belong, no matter how long it takes. Camille nodded, her resolve strengthening. Together, they knew they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. One bright Saturday morning, as the Smith family prepared to enjoy a quiet day at home, Jacob noticed Mrs. Carter walking her dog, Pippin, past their house. She paused briefly, as if debating whether to acknowledge him or continue walking. Determined to remain cordial, Jacob raised a hand in greeting. Morning, Mrs. Carter, he called cheerfully. She turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable, before replying stiffly, Good morning, Mr. Smith. Without another word, she resumed her walk, her posture as rigid as ever. Jacob sighed and headed back into the house, where Camille was setting out breakfast. "I don't know what it is with her," he said, settling into his chair. "I keep trying to be friendly, but it's like there's this wall I can't get through." Camille nodded, placing a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan. "I've noticed it too," she said. "It feels like more than just being stuck in her ways. I don't think she wants us here." "Maybe she's just not used to having new people around," Olivia chimed in, ever the optimist. "Maybe," Jacob said with a shrug, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Years of working in law enforcement had given him a keen sense for reading people, and he suspected that Mrs. Carter's attitude went deeper than discomfort with change. The neighborhood continued to reveal its true colors in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Snippets of conversations overheard at the park or while walking the dog hinted at an undercurrent of resistance. Phrases like, "The neighborhood used to be so different," or "Things aren't like they used to be," were couched in nostalgia, but carried an unmistakable weight of judgment. Jacob and Camille understood what was really being said, though they chose not to dwell on it. Still, the remarks lingered in their minds, a reminder that not everyone was ready to embrace their presence. One evening, after dinner, the Smiths sat on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze as the day faded into dusk. Camille leaned against Jacob, her voice soft as she asked, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if we'd moved somewhere else?" Jacob gazed out at the quiet street, where the last traces of sunlight danced on the rooftops. "I do," he admitted. "But we can't live our lives worrying about what other people think. We belong here just as much as anyone else." Camille nodded, though there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I know," she said, "but sometimes it feels like we'll always be the outsiders." "We won't be," Jacob said firmly. "This is our home now, and we're going to make it work, no matter what anyone else thinks. As time passed, the Smiths focused on building their life in Cedarville, determined not to let the tension define their experience. Jacob poured himself into his role as police chief, making meaningful strides and becoming a positive force in the community. Camille found fulfillment in her teaching, where her students from diverse backgrounds looked up to her as a source of guidance and kindness. Olivia and Ethan began to thrive in their new schools. Olivia, with her outgoing personality, quickly formed a close-knit group of friends. Ethan, though quieter, grew to enjoy school, delighting in his new routine. Slowly but surely, the Smiths started to feel at home. However, Mrs. Carter's presence was a constant reminder that not everyone shared their enthusiasm. She maintained her routine of walking Pippin past their house, her expression unchanged, her greetings cold and perfunctory. It was clear she had no intention of welcoming them into the fold. One afternoon, Camille was in the front yard, tending to her flower beds, enjoying the solitude of her gardening. Mrs. Carter approached, and this time she didn't simply walk by. She stopped, her sharp eyes fixed on the blooms Camille was planting. "Those petunias," Mrs. Carter began, her tone clipped and disapproving. "They don't do well in the shade, you know." Camille straightened, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Thank you for the advice, Mrs. Carter," she replied, her tone warm despite the critique. Mrs. Carter didn't acknowledge the thanks, her gaze still fixed critically on the flowers. There was a long pause, as though she was searching for something else to comment on. Finally, she nodded curtly and said, "Well, good day, Mrs. Smith," before turning and walking away. Camille watched her retreating figure, her shoulders tensing before she exhaled slowly. The exchange, like so many others with Mrs. Carter, left her feeling drained. That evening, she shared the encounter with Jacob. "She just can't seem to let it go," Camille said, frustration creeping into her voice. "It's like she's waiting for us to make a mistake, just so she can say, 'I told you so.'" Jacob reached over and squeezed her hand. "Let her watch," he said. "We'll keep being who we are, and eventually she'll see there's nothing to be afraid of." Camille smiled at him, her resolve renewed. "You're right. This is our home, and we're not going anywhere." With that, the Smiths prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, their commitment to building a life in Cedarville stronger than ever. Camille smiled, comforted by Jacob's steady presence. "You're right," she said, leaning against him. "We'll make this work, no matter what." As the weeks passed, the Smiths continued to settle into their new home in Cedarville. They knew they were being watched and judged by some of their neighbors, perhaps even resented. But they refused to let the opinions of a few dictate their happiness. Jacob and Camille had always believed in the power of community. With Jacob's role as police chief, they saw an opportunity to bring people together, to foster connection and understanding. That's when an idea began to take shape in Camille's mind. One evening at dinner, Camille raised the idea with her family. "What do you all think about hosting a barbecue next weekend?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We could invite the neighbors, get to know them better, and celebrate Jacob's new job." Olivia's face lit up. "That sounds amazing, Mom. We could have games, music, and tons of food." Ethan, though quieter, nodded in agreement. "It might help us fit in more," he said thoughtfully. Jacob smiled, feeling a surge of pride as he looked around at his family. "I think it's a wonderful idea," he said. "We've met a few neighbors, but this could be a great way to really connect with them. Plus, who doesn't love a good barbecue?" With the decision made, the Smiths threw themselves into planning. Over the next few days, Camille worked tirelessly to craft a menu that would cater to everyone's tastes, including a mix of traditional barbecue favorites and vegetarian options. Jacob focused on the logistics, ensuring the grill was in perfect working order, arranging seating, and setting up a game area for the kids. One evening, as they finalized the guest list, Jacob suggested we should make sure to personally invite everyone. It'll show that we really want them to be there. "Absolutely," Camille agreed. "I'll start with the neighbors we've already met, and then we can work our way around the block." Olivia eagerly volunteered to make the invitations. She spent an entire afternoon cutting out colorful shapes and decorating them with cheerful designs. She was thrilled at the idea of playing hostess, imagining their backyard filled with laughter and conversation. As the day of the barbecue approached, the Smiths began delivering invitations door to door. Most neighbors responded with polite smiles and promises to try to attend. Some seemed genuinely interested, expressing excitement about the gathering. Others, however, were more reserved, their responses non-committal. When Camille and Olivia approached Mrs. Carter's house, Olivia handed her a brightly decorated invitation, smiling wide. "We hope you can make it," she said sweetly. Mrs. Carter glanced at the invitation but didn't take it right away. After a moment, she accepted it with a stiff nod. "I'll have to check my schedule," she said, her tone cool. "But thank you for inviting me." Camille maintained her warm smile. "We'd love to have you there," she said, "but we understand if you're busy." Mrs. Carter nodded again before retreating into her home. Despite the mixed reactions, the Smiths remained optimistic. They knew the barbecue was an opportunity to extend kindness and open their home to the community. As the big day drew near, their backyard began to take shape. A grill station for Jacob, a buffet table for Camille's dishes, and colorful decorations handpicked by the kids. The Smiths worked together tirelessly, their excitement palpable. Though they couldn't predict how the event would unfold, they were determined to make it a day to remember. While many neighbors responded to the Smiths' barbecue invitation with polite enthusiasm or vague assurances, Mrs. Carter's reaction was the one Camille had been most uncertain about. Despite Mrs. Carter's icy demeanor, Camille felt it was important to extend the invitation, hoping it might thaw the chill between them. Taking Olivia along for support, Camille walked over to Mrs. Carter's house. Olivia held the brightly decorated invitation she had carefully crafted. As they stood on the porch, Camille took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. After a short wait, Mrs. Carter opened the door, her expression as stern as ever. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in the sight of Camille and Olivia standing there. "Yes?" she said, her tone clipped. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter," Camille began, her voice warm and friendly. "We wanted to invite you to a barbecue we're hosting this weekend at our place. It's just a casual get-together. A chance for everyone to meet and celebrate Jacob's new role as police chief." Olivia stepped forward, her smile as bright as the colors on the invitation. "We hope you can come," she said sweetly, holding the card out toward Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter glanced at the invitation but made no move to take it. "A barbecue, you say?" she asked, her tone cool and detached. "I'm not sure that's something I'd be interested in." Camille kept her smile steady, though she could feel the tension hanging in the air. "We'd love to have you there. It's just a simple neighborhood gathering," she said gently. "We thought it might be a nice way for everyone to get to know each other better." Mrs. Carter's eyes darted between Camille and Olivia, scrutinizing them. After a long pause, she finally reached out and took the invitation, though she didn't look at it. "I'll have to check my schedule," she said, her voice devoid of any real enthusiasm. "But I wouldn't count on me being there. I'm quite busy, you know." Camille nodded, maintaining her composure. "Of course, if you can make it, we'd love to see you. If not, we understand." Mrs. Carter gave a curt nod, her gaze dropping to Olivia. "Children should be seen and not heard," she remarked offhandedly, before stepping back inside and closing the door without another word. As Camille and Olivia walked back to their house, Olivia looked up at her mother, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, why doesn't Mrs. Carter like us?" Camille sighed and wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Some people are just set in their ways, sweetie. They don't always understand or accept new things, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be kind and include them." Olivia nodded slowly, though her young mind struggled to fully understand. "I hope she comes," she said softly. Camille smiled down at her. "Me too, Olivia. Me too." Back at home, Camille shared the encounter with Jacob. He listened thoughtfully, his expression serious. "She's not going to come," he said after a moment, his voice calm but resolute. "But that's not the point. The point is that we're doing the right thing by inviting her." Camille nodded, though a flicker of sadness crossed her face. "I know. I just wish she could see that we're not here to change anything. We just want to be part of the community." Jacob wrapped his arms around her, offering comfort. "We'll keep being ourselves, Camille. That's all we can do. If she doesn't want to join us, that's her choice." As the day of the barbecue approached, Mrs. Carter found herself increasingly agitated. The idea of the Smiths hosting a neighborhood event felt like an affront to her sense of order. To her, they were outsiders who didn't belong in Cedarville, and their efforts to fit in only deepened her resentment. The thought of them hosting a gathering that could win over the neighbors infuriated her. Unable to contain her frustration, Mrs. Carter began reaching out to other longtime residents, planting seeds of doubt and fear about the Smiths. She couched her comments in seemingly innocent observations, but made her feelings clear. "Did you hear about the barbecue the Smiths are hosting?" she said to one neighbor during their morning walk. "It's certainly ambitious for newcomers, don't you think?" Her companion hesitated. "I suppose it's nice they're trying to get involved," they replied cautiously. Mrs. Nat Carter pounced on the opportunity. "Oh, of course," she said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "But we've always had such a traditional way of doing things here in Cedarville. It's important to be careful, don't you think? We wouldn't want things to change too much." Her words, though veiled in politeness, carried an undertone that lingered in the minds of those she spoke to. While some neighbors dismissed her remarks, others began to view the barbecue with suspicion, questioning whether the Smiths' presence might disrupt the harmony of their close-knit community. As the day of the barbecue approached, Mrs. Carter became more convinced that the Smiths were a threat to everything she valued about Cedarville. The idea of them hosting an event that could win over the neighborhood infuriated her. In her mind, they represented change, a change she was determined to resist. Meanwhile, across the street, the Smiths were busy with final preparations. Their backyard had been transformed into a welcoming space, complete with tables and chairs, a grill station, and a buffet table brimming with food. Camille had outdone herself, preparing an impressive feast of burgers, hot dogs, grilled vegetables, salads, and an array of desserts. Jacob stood at the grill, flipping burgers and carefully checking the temperature of the ribs that had been slow cooking since sunrise. Olivia and Ethan were setting up a game area, complete with beanbags and a small inflatable pool for the neighborhood's younger children. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation. As the first guests began to arrive, the Smiths greeted them warmly. Drinks were offered, and guests were encouraged to make themselves at home. A few neighbors brought dishes to share, complimenting the setup and engaging in cheerful conversation. Jacob and Camille made a point to mingle, getting to know their neighbors and sharing laughs that gradually eased the air of formality. For every neighbor who attended, however, there were others who stayed away. Influenced by Mrs. Carter's whispered warnings, some cited prior commitments, while others simply didn't show up, offering no explanation at all. The Smiths couldn't help but notice the absences, but they refused to let it dampen their spirits. "We'll focus on the people who are here," Jacob said to Camille as he handed out plates of food. "That's what matters." Camille nodded, her smile unwavering. "Exactly. Let's make this a day to remember." True to her word, Mrs. Carter did not attend the barbecue. Instead, she watched from her living room, peering out through the lace curtains that framed her window. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she observed the mix of people gathered in the Smiths' backyard. Young and old, black and white, families with children, and even a few single professionals. To Mrs. Carter, the sight of such a diverse crowd felt like an affront to the Cedarville she cherished. The laughter, the music, and the smell of grilled food grated on her nerves. It was a stark reminder that the Smiths were different, and what was worse, some of her neighbors seemed willing, eager even, to embrace that difference. How could they be so easily swayed? She muttered to herself, pacing the room. How could they overlook the obvious? It's like they've forgotten everything this neighborhood is supposed to stand for. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Carter's frustration grew. She paced back and forth, glancing out the window every few minutes. Each glance heightened her sense of isolation. The sounds of joy and camaraderie from across the street only deepened her anger and resentment. She couldn't understand how the Smiths had managed to garner even a shred of acceptance. To her, it felt like a betrayal, a violation of the Cedarville she had worked so hard to preserve. Across the street, the Smiths remained blissfully unaware of Mrs. Carter's seething disapproval. For them, the barbecue was shaping up to be a success. Guests were laughing, kids were playing, and the air was filled with the delicious aroma of freshly grilled food. "Looks like everyone's having a great time," Olivia said as she handed out lemonade. "They are," Camille replied, watching the scene with pride. "This is exactly what we hoped for, a chance to bring people together." But even as the Smiths celebrated their small victories, Mrs. Carter's resolve hardened. To her, the barbecue wasn't just a party, it was a challenge to the status quo, and she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Despite Mrs. Carter's efforts, the Smiths continued preparing for the barbecue with enthusiasm, unaware of the quiet resistance brewing among some of their neighbors. They remained hopeful that the event would bring people together, bridging the gaps that had begun to reveal themselves. The Smiths, warm and gracious hosts, were unaware of the storm brewing in Mrs. Carter's heart. They had thrown open their backyard with smiles and open arms, determined to connect with their neighbors. As the sun began to dip below the horizon and the barbecue started to wind down, Jacob and Camille stood side by side, watching their guests enjoy the evening. Despite the smaller-than-expected turnout, they felt a sense of accomplishment. The people who had come seemed to be enjoying themselves, chatting, laughing, and indulging in the delicious spread Camille had worked hard to prepare. "We did it," Camille said softly, leaning her head on Jacob's shoulder. "Yeah, we did," Jacob replied, wrapping an arm around her. "And I think we made some new friends today." Olivia and Ethan joined them, both looking tired but happy. "Can we do this again next year?" Olivia asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Jacob chuckled. "We'll see. Let's see how your mom feels after cleaning all this up." Camille laughed. "We'll definitely think about it, Olivia. But for now, let's just enjoy the moment." The Smiths stood together, a family bound by love and resilience, basking in the warmth of the evening. They had no idea that Mrs. Carter's growing resentment was a storm waiting to break, one that would soon place them at the center of an unforeseen conflict. Across the street, Mrs. Carter glared out her window, her jaw tight and her arms crossed over her chest. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of the barbecue continuing well into the evening. She had watched the guests arrive, seen neighbors laughing and mingling with the Smiths, and heard the music and merriment spill into the street. Each moment grated on her nerves. To Mrs. Carter, the Smiths were intruders. The idea that some of her neighbors might accept them, even embrace them, felt like a betrayal. How could they be so brazen? She muttered to herself, her foot tapping impatiently against the hardwood floor. How could they think they could just come here, throw a big party, and act like they belong? The thought of the Smiths feeling comfortable in her neighborhood made her blood boil. Her resentment festered, and with each passing moment, her frustration grew. Finally, she decided she had had enough. Mrs. Carter picked up her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed 911. She swallowed hard, her breath quickening as the line rang. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm professional voice of the dispatcher. Yes, hello, Mrs. Carter began, her voice carefully measured, tinged with feigned concern. I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a lot of noise coming from my neighbor's house. It's been going on for hours now, and I'm worried something might be wrong. The dispatcher asked a series of routine questions, and Mrs. Carter answered them all, painting the picture she wanted the police to see. There's loud music, shouting, and, well, some suspicious behavior, she added, lowering her voice as if fearful of being overheard. She paused, then dropped her tone to a whisper. They're new to the neighborhood. I don't know who all these people are, and I'm concerned for our safety. Her words were deliberate, each one chosen to plant doubt in the dispatcher's mind. The dispatcher assured her that officers would be sent to investigate and ended the call. Mrs. Carter hung up, a twisted sense of satisfaction washing over her. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had taken a stand to protect her neighborhood from these unwanted outsiders. Mrs. Carter sat stiffly by her window, her gaze locked on the Smiths' backyard. The barbecue was still in full swing, the sounds of laughter and cheerful conversation drifting through the air. She sneered, imagining the moment when the police would arrive, lights flashing, to shut the whole thing down. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before order was restored. Meanwhile, across the street, Jacob and Camille were basking in the success of the evening. The barbecue had exceeded their expectations. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, with neighbors mingling and enjoying the hospitality. Jacob stood near the grill, deep in conversation with a couple of neighbors who were asking about his new role as Cedarville's police chief. They laughed at his stories, genuinely curious about his journey and how he planned to serve the community. On the other side of the yard, Camille was chatting with another group, sharing stories about their move and the challenges of settling into a new neighborhood. Her warmth drew people in, and it was clear that those who attended were beginning to see the Smiths not as outsiders, but as potential friends. Olivia and Ethan played with a few neighborhood kids, their laughter filling the air as they raced around the yard. The smell of grilled food still lingered, mixing with the sweet scent of lavender and marigolds that Camille had planted along the fence. Camille glanced over at Jacob and smiled. Seeing him laughing and connecting with their neighbors filled her with pride. This was exactly what they had hoped for, a chance to build a life here and be part of something meaningful. But the peace of the evening was about to be shattered. At the police station, the dispatcher relayed the details of Mrs. Carter's call to two officers on duty. The complaint seemed routine, just another noise disturbance. The officers grabbed their gear and headed out, their minds on autopilot. Noise complaints were usually resolved with a simple warning or a polite request to turn the volume down. As they drove through the quiet streets of Cedarville, the officers chatted idly. One glanced at the address on the screen, noting it was in one of the town's newer developments. Didn't the new police chief move somewhere around here? He asked his partner. The other officer shrugged. I think so. Not sure exactly where, though. Their conversation drifted back to the call as they approached the address. Flashing lights from their squad car reflected off the windows of nearby homes as they neared the Smiths' house. The faint sound of music and voices grew louder. From her window, Mrs. Carter's heart raced as she spotted the police car pull up to the curb. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. She pictured the officers marching into the Smiths' backyard, the shocked expressions on their faces, the hush that would fall over the crowd as everyone realized they had overstepped their bounds. Her anticipation was palpable as she watched the officers step out of their vehicle, their expressions neutral as they began walking up the driveway. Mrs. Carter could hardly contain her excitement, convinced that this moment would prove the Smiths didn't belong in Cedarville. In the Smiths' backyard, the sound of approaching footsteps caught Jacob's attention. He turned and saw two officers walking toward them, their faces serious. The mood of the barbecue shifted instantly. Laughter and chatter faded as guests noticed the unexpected police presence. Camille's eyes darted to Jacob, her expression questioning. "What's going on?" she whispered, stepping closer to him. Jacob's brow furrowed, his instincts kicking in. He had dealt with countless situations like this during his career, but it felt different now that it was happening in his own home. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Let me handle it." As Jacob moved to greet the officers, Mrs. Carter continued to watch from her window, her excitement mounting. She was certain a confrontation was about to unfold, one that would send a clear message. The Smiths didn't belong in her neighborhood. But what she didn't realize was that the outcome of this encounter would not go as she had imagined. "Good evening, officers," Jacob greeted, his voice calm but firm. "Can I help you?" The officers hesitated, their eyes widening slightly as they recognized him. One of them cleared his throat, visibly surprised. "Chief Smith?" the officer stammered. "We didn't realize this was your residence." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. "What seems to be the problem?" The other officer glanced at his notes, the weight of the situation dawning on him. "We received a call about a noise disturbance and some suspicious activity in the area," he explained, his tone now more respectful. Jacob's expression remained neutral, but inside he felt a mix of anger and disappointment. He knew exactly what this was. Someone had called the police on them, not because of actual wrongdoing, but because they didn't want the Smiths in their neighborhood. "I see," Jacob said, his voice steady. "Well, as you can see, we're just having a barbecue with a few of our neighbors. There's nothing suspicious happening here." The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. It was obvious to them now that the situation was nothing like what had been described in the call. "We'll just take a quick look around to be thorough," one officer said, his tone apologetic. "Of course," Jacob replied, stepping aside. "Feel free." The officers made a brief inspection of the backyard, their steps slow and methodical. The Smiths' guests watched in uneasy silence, their earlier joy replaced by a palpable tension. Camille stood close to Jacob, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be fine. They're just doing their job." "But," Camille began, but Jacob cut her off with a quiet look. Even as he spoke the reassuring words, Jacob couldn't shake the bitter reality of the moment. It was a painful reminder that no matter his position or achievements, there were still people who viewed him and his family as outsiders. Across the street, Mrs. Carter watched the scene unfold from her window, her initial excitement slowly giving way to confusion. She had anticipated a confrontation, maybe even an arrest. But instead, the officers were calm, their movements deliberate but unhurried. "What's going on?" she thought, her heart sinking. "Why aren't they doing anything?" Her frustration grew as she watched the officers finish their inspection and return to speak with Jacob. From her vantage point, she couldn't hear the conversation, but their body language made it clear they weren't taking any action. This wasn't what she had hoped for. In the Smiths' backyard, the officers approached Jacob once more. One of them spoke, his voice filled with genuine regret. "Everything looks fine here, Chief. We're sorry for the inconvenience. It seems this was just a misunderstanding." Jacob nodded, his composure unwavering. "No problem, officers. I appreciate you checking in. Have a good evening." The officers nodded in return, their expressions a mix of respect and embarrassment. As they walked back to their patrol car, the tension in the backyard began to dissipate, though a lingering heaviness remained like a stubborn cloud refusing to clear. Camille let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I can't believe someone called the police on us," she murmured, her voice tinged with disbelief. The guests, sensing the tension, tried to resume their earlier conversations, but the atmosphere had undeniably shifted. Jacob and Camille exchanged glances, silently agreeing to carry on with the evening. "Let's not let this ruin the night," Jacob said quietly to Camille. Camille nodded, though the weight of the incident lingered in her heart. She knew it wasn't just about the barbecue, it was a reflection of something deeper, something that wouldn't be resolved so easily. Across the street, Mrs. Carter continued to watch as the police car pulled away, the officers leaving without so much as a raised voice or reprimand. Her excitement had been replaced by confusion, and now a simmering frustration. How had this gone so wrong? She had expected the police to handle the situation, to send a clear message that the Smiths didn't belong. Instead, it seemed as though nothing had happened at all. For the first time, a flicker of fear crept into her thoughts. What if the Smiths knew she was the one who had called? What if her neighbors started to side with them? Mrs. Carter paced her living room, her mind racing with possibilities. She had wanted to put the Smiths in their place, but now it felt as though she had lost control of the situation entirely. Back in the backyard, Jacob and Camille worked to bring the focus back to the celebration. They mingled with their guests, offering food and laughter where they could, determined not to let the incident overshadow the entire evening. But as the night wore on, the question remained heavy in the air. Who had called the police? And why? Jacob pulled Camille close, resting his chin on her head. "I can," he said quietly, the weight of reality pressing down on him. He had always known that his career in law enforcement wouldn't shield him or his family from prejudice. It was a hard truth he had hoped his children wouldn't have to face so soon, but here they were. Around them, the guests began to relax again, though the atmosphere had clearly shifted. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter and more subdued. The children, sensing the change in mood, stayed closer to their parents. Olivia and Ethan, who had been playing near the fence, approached their parents, their young faces marked by confusion. "Daddy, why were the police here?" Ethan asked in a small voice. Jacob knelt down to his son's level, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's okay, buddy. Someone made a mistake, and the police just came to check things out. Everything's fine now." "But why would someone call the police?" Olivia asked, her young mind grappling with the unfairness of it all. Jacob sighed, wishing he could shield them from the complexities of the world for just a little longer. "Sometimes people get scared of things they don't understand," he explained gently. "And when they're scared, they make bad decisions, but the important thing is that we're all safe and nothing bad happened." Olivia seemed to accept this explanation, though the dissatisfaction lingered in her eyes. Ethan, still looking confused, nodded, trusting his father's words. Camille bent down and kissed their heads. "Why don't you two go play with your friends?" she suggested, her voice soft but firm. "Everything's fine now." The kids hesitated for a moment, then ran off to rejoin the other children, though they kept glancing back at their parents, still trying to make sense of what had happened. Across the street, Mrs. Carter stood at her window, her hands clenched into fists as she watched the police car pull away without incident. Her frustration was palpable, her face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. How could this have gone so wrong? She had expected the police to handle the situation, to make it clear that the Smiths didn't belong. Instead, the officers had left without so much as a reprimand. A pang of fear gripped her as the realization set in. Her plan had backfired. The Smiths had not been intimidated. If anything, they seemed more resolute. Worse, what if they figured out she had made the call? What if the other neighbors started to side with them? Mrs. Carter began pacing her living room, her mind racing. She had to do something to regain control of the situation, but what? Her thoughts were a chaotic mix of fear, resentment, and a nagging doubt that she may have underestimated the Smiths. Still, her resolve hardened. She would not let them win. This was her neighborhood, and she would do whatever it took to keep it that way. Back at the barbecue, the mood had lightened somewhat. The Smiths made a concerted effort to keep the incident from overshadowing the entire evening. Jacob and Camille moved through the crowd, checking in with guests and thanking them for coming. One neighbor, Mrs. Harris, a kind, elderly woman who had been one of the few to attend the barbecue, approached Camille with a sympathetic expression. "I'm so sorry about what happened, dear," Mrs. Harris said softly. "It's such a shame that someone would do that to you." Camille smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. It's unfortunate, but we're not going to let it ruin our night." Mrs. Harris nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "You and your family are always welcome here, Camille. Don't let a few bad apples make you feel otherwise." "Thank you. That means a lot," Camille replied, squeezing the older woman's hand. As the evening continued, the Smiths focused on creating positive memories despite the disruption. Neighbors lingered, chatting and enjoying the warm hospitality, though the event's earlier exuberance had dimmed slightly. Camille stole a glance at Jacob, who was speaking with a small group of neighbors. His calm, steady demeanor reassured her, even as her own emotions churned. They had faced an ugly reality tonight, but they had also seen glimmers of support and kindness from those around them. The barbecue wound down as night fell, and guests began to leave, offering warm thanks and promises to stay in touch. Camille and Jacob stood side by side as they bid their neighbors farewell, their united front unshaken. As the last guest departed, Camille let out a deep breath, looking out at the now quiet backyard. "We made it through," she said softly. Jacob wrapped an arm around her. "We did, and we're not going anywhere." Across the street, Mrs. Carter sat in the darkness of her living room, the glow of the Smiths' porch light illuminating the street. Her frustration had settled into a cold determination. She didn't know how yet, but she was certain this wasn't over. Jacob and Camille sat at the patio table, both feeling the weight of the evening settling heavily on their shoulders. Inside, the children were already asleep, worn out from the day's events. The house was silent. "What a night," Camille murmured, breaking the stillness. Jacob nodded, his thoughts still on the encounter with the police. "I knew this wasn't going to be easy," he admitted, "but I didn't expect something like this to happen so soon." Camille looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "Do you think this is just the beginning?" she asked softly. Jacob considered her question, his mind turning over the possibilities. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I do know one thing, we're not going anywhere. We belong here just as much as anyone else." Camille reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll get through this, Jacob, together." He squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of gratitude for her strength. "Yeah, we will," he said firmly. For a moment they sat in silence, drawing comfort from each other. The night air was crisp, and the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if offering a quiet reassurance. They held on to the hope that things would improve, though they both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Carter's actions had revealed something deeper, an undercurrent of prejudice that wasn't going to vanish overnight. There would undoubtedly be more challenges, more moments where they would need to stand up for themselves and their right to be part of the community. But the Smiths were no strangers to adversity. They had faced obstacles before, and they knew they could face them again. What mattered most was that they had each other. As long as they stood together, they believed they could overcome anything. As the night drew to a close, Jacob and Camille began to clean up the remnants of the barbecue. They worked side by side in silence, their thoughts occupied with what the future might hold for their family. But as they picked up the pieces, they also found the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for the life they wanted to build in Cedarville. Under the starlit sky, Jacob and Camille made a quiet but unshakable vow to themselves and to each other. No matter what happened, they would not be driven out. They would stay, they would thrive, and they would show everyone that they belonged. The following week, Jacob decided to take a proactive step to address the tensions that had surfaced in the neighborhood. While the incident with Mrs. Carter had been a painful reminder of the prejudices that lingered beneath the surface, it also presented an opportunity for dialogue, understanding, and growth. To that end, Jacob organized a community meeting at the Cedarville Community Center. His goal was to foster open conversations and begin building bridges among the residents. Camille threw herself into helping with the preparations. She spent the days leading up to the meeting designing flyers and delivering them to neighbors, making sure that everyone felt included. She was determined to create a space where people could share their thoughts and feelings openly. On the day of the meeting, the auditorium at the community center was set up with neat rows of chairs facing a podium at the front. Jacob and Camille arrived early to arrange refreshments and ensure everything was in place. As people began to trickle in, Jacob greeted each neighbor with a warm smile, striving to create an atmosphere of openness and trust. Gradually, the room filled with a diverse mix of residents. Some were familiar faces like Mrs. Harris, who had shown unwavering support for the Smiths. Others were neighbors who had been more distant or hesitant, drawn by curiosity or a sense of obligation. Jacob took a deep breath, his resolve firm. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he and Camille were taking the first steps toward building a stronger, more united community. When the meeting finally began, Jacob stepped up to the podium. His posture was confident, yet approachable, and he took a deep breath before speaking. He made eye contact with as many people as he could, letting the room settle into a quiet hum of anticipation. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Jacob Smith, and I am your new police chief. I know that the past week has been challenging for many of us, and I want to take this opportunity to address some of the issues that have come to light." Jacob paused, letting his words sink in. "As many of you are aware, there was an incident at my family's barbecue last week. A complaint was made, and the police responded. I want to assure you that we are committed to maintaining the safety and well-being of everyone in this community. However," he continued, "it's equally important to address the underlying issues that led to that complaint." The room was silent, but Jacob could see nods of agreement here and there. "Our neighborhood has always prided itself on being welcoming and inclusive. Yet incidents like this remind us that there's still work to be done. We must ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, feels that they belong here." Jacob's words resonated with many in the audience, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. He went on to emphasize the importance of respect and understanding, pointing out that both overt and subtle prejudices could harm the fabric of the community they all shared. After his speech, Jacob opened the floor for questions and comments. The atmosphere in the room was a mixture of apprehension and hopefulness. Some neighbors were eager to express their support, while others seemed hesitant but willing to engage. Mrs. Harris was the first to speak. "I want to thank you, Chief Smith, for organizing this meeting," she said warmly. "It's important that we have open discussions about these issues. I've lived in Cedarville for over 30 years, and I've always believed that our community should be inclusive and welcoming to all." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. Jacob smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris. Your support means a great deal to us." Another neighbor, Mr. Ramirez, stood up next. "I think it's important to acknowledge that this issue isn't just about one person or one incident," he said. "It's about how we as a community respond to these situations. We need to stand together and support each other." Jacob nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. This is about building a stronger, more united community. We need to ensure that everyone feels heard and valued." As the discussion continued, residents began to open up. Some shared personal stories of discrimination and misunderstanding, moments of prejudice that had been ignored or overlooked in the past. The dialogue was emotional and at times uncomfortable, but it was a necessary step toward healing. Then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Carter raised her hand. Her voice was shaky but determined as she spoke. "I want to apologize for my actions last week," she said, her gaze fixed on Jacob. "I made a mistake, and I realize that now. I didn't consider the impact it would have on your family or the community." Jacob looked at her with a mixture of empathy and firmness. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Carter. Apologies are an important part of moving forward. But actions speak louder than words. It's crucial that we all work together to make this neighborhood a better place for everyone." Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression somber. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends." In the weeks that followed, the meeting proved to be a turning point. Small but significant changes began to take root in Cedarville. Conversations between neighbors became more open and genuine. People who had previously kept to themselves started to show up for community events, and a renewed sense of unity began to emerge. Jacob and Camille continued to engage with their neighbors, hosting informal gatherings and encouraging dialogue. They knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were heartened by the progress they were beginning to see. Mrs. Carter, too, made an effort to integrate herself more positively into the community. While trust didn't rebuild instantly, her willingness to participate and take responsibility for her actions marked a step in the right direction. For the Smiths, the meeting was a reminder of why they had chosen Cedarville in the first place. Despite the challenges, they remained committed to building a life in the neighborhood, not just for themselves, but for the greater good of the community. The meeting at the Cedarville Community Center had done more than Jacob and Camille Smith could have hoped. It sparked a renewed sense of unity and purpose among many of their neighbors. Determined to build on this momentum, the Smiths continued to engage with the community, organizing events and activities aimed at fostering connections and promoting inclusivity. One of their most successful initiatives was a neighborhood block party designed to celebrate the diversity of Cedarville. The event featured food from various cultures, live music, and games for children. It provided a welcoming, laid-back environment for everyone to come together and enjoy each other's company. The block party was an undeniable success. Neighbors who had previously been distant or hesitant began to mingle and interact, breaking down barriers and forming new connections. The joyful atmosphere of the event helped transform Cedarville into a community where differences were not only accepted, but celebrated. Jacob and Camille took the opportunity to chat with as many people as possible, sharing their journey and listening to the concerns of others. They wanted to ensure that everyone felt heard and valued. Mrs. Carter, who had been reluctant to attend at first, eventually showed up at the event. Her interactions with other residents were polite but cautious as she tried to navigate the changed dynamics. When Jacob and Camille spotted her, they approached her warmly. "I'm glad you could make it, Mrs. Carter," Camille said, handing her a plate of food with a kind smile. "I hope you're enjoying the party." Mrs. Carter accepted the plate, her expression softening. "Thank you, Camille. I appreciate the invitation. I'm trying to understand and be a better part of this community." Jacob smiled at her, his tone encouraging. "That's a step in the right direction. We're all here to support each other and make this neighborhood stronger." Mrs. Carter nodded, her demeanor lighter than it had been in weeks. Over the following months, the Smiths remained active in their mission to promote inclusivity and understanding. They organized educational workshops, hosted open forums for discussions, and participated in local initiatives aimed at bringing neighbors together. The neighborhood, once fractured by prejudice and misunderstanding, began to heal. New friendships blossomed, and old grievances were addressed with open hearts and minds. The Smith family, once viewed as outsiders, became known not only as integral members of the community, but as advocates for positive change. Even Mrs. Carter, who had initially been resistant, began to show genuine efforts to integrate and contribute positively to the neighborhood. Her transformation was slow and steady. She started attending community activities and showing support for Cedarville's increasingly diverse residents. While trust didn't rebuild overnight, her willingness to change earned her the cautious respect of her neighbors. Olivia and Ethan thrived in their new environment. They made friends from various backgrounds and enjoyed the inclusive spirit that Cedarville had begun to embrace. Their experiences reflected the powerful impact of the Smiths' efforts. For the first time, the children felt fully at home, surrounded by a community that valued and celebrated their family's presence. The Smith family's story became a testament to resilience and the importance of standing up for what is right. Despite the challenges they had faced, they transformed a difficult situation into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and positive change. Jacob and Camille knew that their journey was only one part of a much larger process. But they took pride in the progress they had made, facing adversity with grace and determination. Their story became a reminder that change is always possible when people come together with a shared commitment to fairness and respect. Cedarville had become a neighborhood where differences were embraced and every resident had a voice. The Smith family's experience proved that even in the face of prejudice, a community united by empathy and understanding could overcome any obstacle and create a brighter future for everyone. Months after the community began addressing its tensions, the Smiths noticed a marked shift in the spirit of Cedarville. The initial awkwardness and division had been replaced by a genuine desire to foster lasting connections. Inspired by these positive changes, Jacob and Camille decided to embark on a new project to solidify the neighborhood's growing unity. A community garden. The idea was straightforward yet profound. create a shared space where neighbors could grow vegetables, flowers, and herbs. More than just a practical project, the community garden was envisioned as a symbol of growth, cooperation, and unity. Jacob and Camille Smith proposed the idea to Cedarville's neighborhood association, and their enthusiasm was met with resounding support from many residents. The Community Garden Initiative officially launched with a planning meeting held at the local park. Jacob and Camille presented their vision to a group of eager attendees, explaining the many benefits of the garden. They highlighted its potential to promote healthy eating, encourage outdoor activities, and foster connections among neighbors. Mrs. Carter, who had been working hard to rebuild trust with the community, stood up during the meeting. "I think this is a wonderful idea," she said, her tone sincere. "It's a way for us to come together and work on something that benefits everyone. I'd love to help with the planning and maintenance." Her willingness to contribute was met with nods and smiles of approval from the other attendees. For Jacob and Camille, her involvement marked an important step in her journey toward reconciliation. The community rallied behind the garden project. Volunteers of all ages came together to clear the land, prepare the soil, and construct raised planting beds. The garden was thoughtfully designed to include a vegetable patch, a flower garden, and an herb section. There was even a designated area for children, where they could grow their own mini gardens and learn about plants and nature. As project coordinators, Jacob and Camille took the lead in organizing workdays and coordinating with local businesses for donations. Cedarville's small businesses were eager to support the initiative, offering seeds, tools, and even financial contributions. As the garden began to take shape, it quickly became a hub of activity. Neighbors gathered to work side by side, sharing gardening tips and swapping stories. For many, the process was a therapeutic escape from the stresses of daily life. Mrs. Carter, who had once kept a critical distance from the Smith family, was now a frequent and enthusiastic participant. She could often be found working alongside her neighbors, chatting and laughing as they planted flowers or tended to the growing vegetables. The garden became a space where old grudges faded and new bonds blossomed. By late summer, the garden began to yield its first crops, and the neighborhood decided to celebrate their success with a harvest festival. The festival was planned as a community-wide event to showcase the fruits of their labor and bring everyone together in celebration. Held in the same park where the garden was conceived, the festival featured colorful banners, live music, and booths displaying fresh produce, homemade jams, and even a small farmer's market with goods from local vendors. The event also included plenty of activities for children, from face painting to a petting zoo. The cheerful atmosphere and lively music made the day unforgettable, as families strolled through the booths sampling fresh vegetables and enjoying homemade treats. Jacob and Camille walked through the bustling festival, greeting neighbors and soaking in the sense of community that surrounded them. Their vision for the garden had come to life, and the positive energy was palpable. As they moved through the crowd, Mrs. Carter approached them, her face glowing with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you both for spearheading this project," she said. Her voice was warm and genuine. "It's been a wonderful experience, and I think it's really brought us all together." Jacob smiled warmly at her. "I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Carter. It's been a rewarding experience for all of us." Camille added, her tone filled with pride. "We couldn't have done it without everyone's support. It's been incredible to see what we can accomplish when we work together." Over the years, the Cedarville Community Garden became a cherished part of the neighborhood. Its thriving greenery stood as a testament to the power of collaboration and the importance of working together toward a shared goal. The garden wasn't just a space for growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs. It was a beacon of unity, where neighbors gathered for seasonal festivals, educational workshops, and volunteer days. It became a hub for knowledge sharing and friendship building, offering everyone a place to belong. Jacob and Camille Smith remained deeply involved in the garden's success. They often led workshops on gardening techniques, hosted community events, and continued their advocacy for inclusivity and understanding. Drawing from their own experiences, they inspired others to embrace change and work toward harmony. Mrs. Carter, who had once been a symbol of resistance, underwent a remarkable transformation. She became one of the garden's most dedicated volunteers, regularly tending to the plants and organizing events. Her willingness to change and contribute positively became a shining example of how individuals can grow and adapt. Her leadership and engagement in the community made her an advocate for unity, and she played an instrumental role in fostering a spirit of cooperation. For Olivia and Ethan, the garden became a formative part of their childhood. They actively participated, helping with planting, watering, and harvesting. Through these small acts, they learned the value of community, cooperation, and giving back. The neighborhood, once divided by prejudice and misunderstanding, evolved into a model of inclusivity and togetherness. The garden became a symbol of the profound changes that could be achieved when people embraced a shared vision for a better future. As Jacob and Camille reflected on their journey, they felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They had faced significant challenges, from subtle exclusion to overt hostility, but their perseverance and commitment to fostering understanding had transformed their neighborhood. The garden, they realized, had become much more than a physical space. It was a catalyst for personal and communal growth. It had healed wounds, bridged divides, and created a more inclusive environment where everyone felt valued and respected. While the Smiths were proud of the progress they'd made, they understood that their journey was far from over. Building and maintaining a strong, inclusive community required ongoing effort. They remained committed to nurturing the relationships they had forged and addressing new challenges as they arose. Walking through the garden one crisp morning, surrounded by the vibrant colors of blooming flowers and the fresh scent of herbs, Jacob and Camille felt a profound sense of pride. They had faced adversity with resilience and grace, and their efforts had paved the way for a brighter, more inclusive future for Cedarville. The Smith family's story was one of hope and transformation. It was a reminder that change is always possible when people come together with a shared commitment to understanding, respect, and action. The Cedarville Community Garden, with its lush greenery and thriving plants, stood as a lasting testament to the strength of unity. It embodied the values of a community bound by shared goals and mutual respect. In the end, Cedarville had not only grown as a neighborhood, but had also cultivated a deep sense of belonging and inclusivity that would endure for years to come. The Smith family had sown the seeds of change, and their efforts had blossomed into a vibrant, flourishing community where everyone had a place and a voice. What would you have done if you were in Jacob and Camille's position and faced such unexpected hostility from a neighbor? Would you have responded with grace and unity, or would you have hesitated? If you enjoyed this story of resilience and reconciliation, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put immense effort into creating these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.